Picture Book Summit. Picture Book Summit.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our Picture Book Summit Roundtable. Our roundtable is where we bring you in on the conversations that we're having about picture books, the picture book industry, writing picture books, articles and things that we see, all those things that we kind of talk about on our own. We like to bring you guys in and include you in the conversation too. So lately, we've been talking about dark picture books. And so we thought this would make an interesting topic for the podcast and for YouTube. So, Julie, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, so this was really interesting. It came up after Picture Book Summit this year, but one of the summiteers who's also a member of 12 by 12 posted about Mac and John's session in the 12 by 12 Facebook group saying that we talk a lot about rereadability in picture books and the importance of writing books in such a way that kids want to read them over and over again. But with dark picture books, and by dark here in this conversation, we're referring to tough topics or difficult topics rather than dark or subversive humor. So this
Which could
came
be
up,
its whole episode all by
which
itself,
would be a
subversive
whole
humor.
episode all by itself, and it's important to state that because John and Mac certainly write the dark subversive humor type books. But the conversation came up in the context of the Donald Cruz book that they shared, Shortcut, which was essentially, kids potentially like dying because they take a shortcut and maybe get hit by a train, right? And that was the instigation for this conversation that took place on Facebook. But the question was, do kids really want to reread books that are dealing with topics that are difficult, like grief or war or refugees or what have you, or natural disasters, all of these things? Because that's one of the things we preach, right? Is you want to make it so that the child wants to revisit the book. And it led to a conversation that I thought was fascinating because I hadn't really ever thought of it this way before. That we do sort of give general advice, but what I think is that these books serve a very specific, important, critical purpose. And it's possible that a child may not pick up a book that's dealing with a tragedy and want to read it over and over and over again. However, it is important that they learn about these events, that they develop empathy. And one thing that was very clear to me, and I think for you too, Kelly, when we went to ALA, American Library Association conference this summer, is that the school and library market is gigantic for children's books. And that's where you see a huge need for books like this, because librarians want to be able to share books, teachers who are meeting curriculum requirements, and also they have students who maybe are struggling with specific things that they can then share a book with them. I also notice in Facebook groups, all different kinds of social media, when people are asking for book recommendations, many, many times it's to help a child deal with a specific hardship or event that they're experiencing in their own lives. So the answer is maybe they don't read them over and over again, or what I would suspect is more true is they might read them for a time in a season, in a space when they really need that book, and that teachers, librarians, parents, whatever, are using them as tools for teaching. And then the last thing I'll say is absolutely the writing is still so important.
Mm-hmm.
because
Maybe more so.
Yeah,
more
more
so,
so.
I think this is the reason why a lot of these books are written lyrically,
Mm.
because there's a musicality and kind of lends a bit of softness to
Yeah.
something that might otherwise be very hard. But the writing, first of all, has to be age appropriate, but it also has to be compelling enough to give the child a payoff for having read something that may be difficult to think about or process.
That's a great point. Well, you know, in my Picture Book Summit presentation this year, I talked a little bit about Bruno Bettelheim, who was a famous psychologist or psychiatrist, and he was a Holocaust survivor. So he knew about pain and suffering, and he was a psychologist. And he talked about the emotional and symbolic and therapeutic importance of fairy tales. He was really well known, and he had a book about that. And the quote that I had for my presentation was, "What cannot be talked about cannot be put to rest. And if it is not, the wounds will fester from generation to generation." And he was talking about something huge, the Holocaust. But even things like, you guys know that how it was for me when I lost my dog and then the Rough Patch came out. And just thinking about that book brings tears to my eyes. It was so helpful, and it was so cathartic to read it. And it's about a character who loses his dog. And it's the first book I've ever seen that deals with death in a very stark yet gentle way, because you see the dog, he's bending over his dog, and it just slays you. But I think that seeing how he comes out of it too, and for picture books, you don't just end with the dead dog. That would not be a good idea. But you end with him dealing with his sorrow and his grief, and he's angry, and he goes through all the stages, but it doesn't say, and then he went through the angry stage. You know, you see him tearing up the garden. And this book, I think, is a perfect example of how to deal with something that's tough to talk about. And it's Brian Lee's. If anybody doesn't know this book, it's a brilliant book. And at the end, he comes through it. And even though he's had to deal with that loss, he has really come through it. And you see that there is hope at the end. And if you don't talk about it, we all know that when you can get into those night thoughts, something you didn't deal with, and you just keep thinking of different ways you could have said something, and if you don't talk about these things, it does fester. So I think that there is a definite place for books about very difficult things to talk about. So as long as the one thing that we want to warn about, and I'm sure you guys are going to agree, is you don't want to bash people over the head with a lecture.
I just want to add that I think one of the things that makes that book so effective is that the illustration is of a fox character coping with the loss of their dog rather than a human child.
Right, which is much easier for the child.
Much easier, exactly. Much easier to kind of process.
It's kind of like, that's a great point, Emma, because it's kind of like writing in first person versus third person when you have a very difficult, when you're writing a novel or even a picture book. But when you're writing third person, you're able to like get some distance. And if it's first person, it's much harder to read when it's a difficult subject. So the fact that I think the fox is third person, and if it had been a human, it would have been first person.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of dead dog books,
I wanted to just say one more thing about the Rough Patch, is that because it's set in a garden, it actually shows over a passage of time. So he doesn't get over his grief immediately. Right. And he isn't just mad for one day, and he isn't just sad for one day. Like, I think it does a really good job of, it's a passage of time, and it takes time before you're ready for that hope at the end. And so the garden was a great metaphor as well, I think. But Julie, you had another dead dog book.
Oh, I was The Longest Let's Go Boy by that book
kills me.
saved me after Rocky passed away, you know. And speaking of language, I encourage all of you pick up both of these books because they're very different takes on the same subject. The Longest Let's Go Boy is written in first person. That's what made me think of it when Katie was talking about
Derek Wilde is the
Eric Wilder,
is the author.
and Katya Chen is the illustrator, and it's written in first person from the dog's perspective.
Yeah.
And this dog has its own dog language, that makes such amazing sense. So that's where Let's Go Boy, The Longest Let's Go Boy comes from. And other tough topics that are important are facing challenges in our school systems, in libraries, and so on. Things like dealing with the history of slavery and the Native American genocide and LGBTQ plus issues and all of these issues where schools and libraries may be the only access that children have to these books that may save their lives. And when you are writing something that is that critical, that important for both the people for whom it's representing, but also to build empathy among other people, the writing, illustrations, we have to do those topics the justice they deserve. And so I guess I'm coming back to, I still think it's very important that you write a book that makes you want to read it again for the language or for the illustrations, or even if it's hard and maybe they won't, but you need the opportunity to be there. I just happened to be at the library yesterday, and one of the books that they had, how they put books on the tops of the shelves, kind of like the equivalent of Face Out at a bookstore. And the ones they had face out was Show Way by Jacqueline Woodson, which won a literary honor. I don't even remember when that book came out, but I heard her read that book. I own it, and I heard her read it at an SCBWI conference, and I had to go lay down in my room afterward. I was so impacted by the subject matter, but also the language of that book. It haunts me in the best possible way today.
What is the subject matter of that book?
Show Way is a book that starts with a young girl being sold into slavery, and it's loosely based on like her own family history, Jacqueline Woodson. And at the end of each kind of section, there's a refrain and she loved that baby up, so she loved that baby up. And even saying, I feel shivers. And that's kind of how each section ends, with like a baby being born. And then we see how the world is changing around them. And finally, we get to the child kind of being born in quote unquote today's time. And so there's a lot of struggle in this book, but also a tremendous amount of love and hope and family and all of these things. But I go back and read it from time to time just for that language and to feel the way that it makes me feel.
Julie, you started out by talking about ALA and how much libraries need these books and everything. And considering that so many books are being banned and gotten rid of, and a lot of states are not teaching Black history and other things that just happened, it's just history. There may be, for a book that is lyrical and beautiful like that, it can bring in the knowledge that is otherwise being redacted.
Correct. Absolutely.
And to your point, I think the questioner who asked about, are these books rereadable or rereading worthy, they get their rereading in the schools and in the libraries. That's where the rereading happens year after year in the curriculum or class after class or school to school. Maybe it's not the kind of book that you snuggle up parent and child, or grandparent and child at bedtime with, but it's a book that has, ongoing resonance in schools and in libraries, in the curriculum or in the classroom, for hundreds and hundreds or thousands of children at a time. And that's a different kind of rereading.
Yep.
Yeah.
I just want to add that I think for me, what fascinates me about what I'm always looking at when I read dark picture books or dark subject picture books, what I'm always fascinated by is the approach the author has taken to the material to make it accessible for a picture book aged audience. And you know how we always talk about in our Caldecott roundtables, we always talk about the Caldecott criteria. Part of the criteria is how child appropriate, how child centric the illustrations are, or whatever the case may be. And in this circumstance, I think what's really interesting is how authors and illustrators make dark subjects child-centric. And so we just talked about the rough patch and Brian Lee's using an animal, an anthropomorphic fox instead of a human. I was fascinated by recently a book called Kamau and Zuzu Find a Way by Aracelis Germay or Gourmet, I'm not sure which, just came out in August of this year. And it's a picture book about African diaspora, and it's quite dark in terms of dealing with being taken from your home and relocated, being uprooted, basically. What's really interesting is that the author, the way they approach it is the story is about a mother and child uprooted from their home and relocated on the moon.
Ugh.
So, what a brilliant way, a sort of a mythical way to approach this extremely real, dark subject. And the illustrations, it's very clear in the illustrations that this is of African origin, this story, and so forth. But the notion of setting it in this sort of fantasy thing of, a family relocated to the moon and missing their original home, that's what makes it picture book worthy. That's
the metaphor of it
yeah,
being as
exactly.
foreign as the moon is to us,
Yeah,
a new
exactly.
land.
And I think that's the task, when you're writing about dark subjects, is how are you going to make this resonant for the picture book aged reader? That additional leap of imagination, child friendliness, whatever it may be, that makes it manageable to navigate that dark subject.
Yeah. It's like, and there are so many ways to do that. But the more you just have to keep working until you find it. For some reason, I got thinking about Angela Van Cran's book, Finding
Finding
Papa,
Papa. Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
Chomp Chomp,
Mhm.
the book about her journey when she and her mother fleeing Vietnam, following her father who had already left to go to the States, and it's kind of this harrowing refugee story. But the girl and the father had played this chomp chomp, alligator game. And so that becomes kind of like a refrain throughout, and it's very childlike, and it keeps you connected to the family and to the father, and then it comes together beautifully at the end. But those are the things that, and of course chomp chomp is very fun to say out loud.
Right.
Make
Yeah.
hand motions. And anyway, I think
So Lubna and Pebble, that's another good example
Yeah,
of
that's a great
it's a,
example.
it's a book
Refugees.
about the refugees and
Yeah.
rather than dwelling on the missing home or the refugee status or the hardships of being, I mean, it does dip into the hardships of being a refugee, but it does it through the angle, through the lens of a comfort object and the child's need for a
Right.
comfort object,
Yeah.
by drawing a smiley face on a pebble. A child needs a friend, a toy, a stuffed animal, whatever it is, or a comfort object. And even in the most desperate of circumstances, that can be a source of comfort. And that's the child-friendly way in,
Right.
Yeah.
So that's
Um,
that's what makes it really effective is when you've taken that extra leap to make it resonant for children, not
And
just
none of these
teaching.
books, yeah, and none of these books are preachy. None of these books lecture at all. Even but there's definitely a lesson. And, a lot of people who are starting out really want to teach a lesson, which is a noble thing to do, to share your knowledge with a child, but nobody wants to be lectured. So I'm saying it all the time, but none of these books do. So go find these books that we're mentioning and absolutely look at how they are teaching lesson without lecturing.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
good
Also,
mentor.
look at the action of what is happening in the story. Because one thing
Yeah.
that I notice when I'm reading manuscripts, early drafts of manuscripts where people are tackling tough subjects, is very often the approach is a young child having a conversation with an adult about
Right.
something, and then the light bulb goes off and they have a realization. And while I'm certain that happens a lot, children talking to the adults in their lives, it's not necessarily the most compelling way to get from point A to point B. And the books that we've talked about show through all of the action, right?
Right.
The fox in the rough patch is not having tea with a friend describing his grief.
Right.
He's like
Right.
ripping up the garden and, stomping around the house and so on. Or Lubna and Pebble, she's making herself a comfort object, and so forth. So really, if you're writing books like this, think about the action, the metaphors, like again, the garden, all of those things that you can use to show and to not preach, but also to show
Right.
through a story rather than just a conversation. Yeah.
Julie, the what we always talk about, Jane Yolen saying, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. Don't let a conversation with your child or your parent or uncle or whatever you want to relay this thing that happened to you in your life when you were a child or something like that, or when your child was a child. And that doesn't matter if it really happened. It really doesn't. You need to tell the story, because memories are not the same as a story. Story has a beginning, middle, and end, and memories not necessarily. So it's a really good thing to remember, to make a story as the pinpoint. It's very easy for me to say. It's very hard to do because I just did it with a manuscript that I totally got. I was like, but the memory got in my way so hard. And so but it's a good thing to remember and just rewrite.
I have a
Eventually.
couple books I want to mention before we go. One of them I read recently. I actually talked to one of our 12 by 12 members at ALA about it, and it's The House Before Falling into the Sea, which is a gorgeous book. It's written by Anne Suk Wong, and it's illustrated by Caldecott honoree Hannah Cha, who you guys know that I love. And it's actually a family story from Anne, but it's from the child's point of view. And what's happening is the Korean War is going on and people are fleeing, and their house is the last house before you fall into the sea. And so her family takes in all of these refugees, basically. I don't even think they call them refugees, but that's what it is. But it's all from the child's point of view, and like, oh, aunts and uncles are here. Oh, friends are here. Oh, there's more kids here. Like they're playing with my toys, and how sort of like this child deals with it, and then it ends on hope, and I think that's really a key in a lot of these dark topics, is leaving our child with hope, because as Julie mentioned, like librarians want to be able to hand the perfect book to the perfect child in whatever situation, and children that are dealing with tough things need to know that there's hope at the end, because I think all of us feel that sometimes when we're in the middle of something, you're not sure, where's the
Right.
light, whenever am I going to get out of this? And I think it's important for kids to see that there is a light. But this is a beautiful book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And then the other one I wanted to bring up was The Skull by John Klassen, which is dark in sort of a different way. And it really harkens back to when you think of like grim fairy tales and where a lot of children's literature started. It started very dark. and I think he kind of brings that.
I think there's a thing about European children's books
Yeah.
tending to be a lot darker, especially in
Yes.
Yeah.
decades past.
And as you read the skull, and granted, this is a very different picture book. It's like, I don't know, 100 pages long or something like, but clearly something bad has happened to this child. And throughout the story, it's sort of dealt with, but in a kind of a dark way. It's not like, the child comes and some nice person gives them hot cocoa and, and puts them to bed, or, like it's kind of a very dark story. And then the child is, anyway, has to work through they never say what it is that the child has gone through, but the child has clearly gone through something bad, and it kind of follows that journey in a different way. And I could see how a child could read this and then want to go back and go, oh wait, where's the clue about this, and how does that relate to that? And much like how I watch a mystery show and I want to go back and binge it from the beginning again, because I want to see, wait, where were the clues there? How did the story build up, and notice those things that you didn't notice the first time? So I think there is some rereadability in that way, as well as kind of going back and going, wait, how did they deal with that? How did we get to the end here?
I also think it's such an interesting thing that, older picture books and European picture books tend to be braver, let's say, in terms of being willing to tackle darker subjects. I think that in America, we have had a tendency in recent decades to almost be overprotective of our children, in this culture that we're almost, yeah, like, here we are in this world of trigger warnings and everything else. And it's like we're robbing. I'm not saying we shouldn't have trigger warnings. I'm just saying let's be careful not to rob ourselves and our children of the opportunity for a teachable moment, the opportunity for a meaningful conversation about something, because these things exist in the world. We can't pretend they don't.
Right.
So better to work through them with a trusted adult in a safe setting where you can absorb and process and talk about and consider and so forth and learn. And obviously also teaches empathy and compassion, many of these books. And I think we have to this is where I get, on my high horse about book banning too, because it's like, you're just robbing your kids of an opportunity for learning, and for you to sit down with them and talk about values, or talk about history, or talk about, processing, tools for process.
Right.
Being emotionally aware of your.
Yeah, being emotionally mature. How do you get that way if you're not ever flexing that muscle?
Kids can handle certain things at certain ages, so it's not like you need to explain the whole process of whatever the tough topic is, like you only need to give them the information that they need. It's just because you open the door to grief doesn't mean that you need to take that to the nth degree and talk about mass murders or something like that. Like it's just, you just give them the little piece of information they need at that
Kelly's
time.
going
and then
super dark now.
Well, I'm just saying, like,
serial killer picture book is
we
haven't
seen that yet. Although plenty of war. I mean, the Catman of Aleppo is dark.
Yeah.
I mean,
and Katie had one about Afghanistan, a village in Afghanistan.
That book just wow.
Yeah, I don't remember.
That was in your
town is gone.
When the circus came to town. Was that?
The circus comes to the village, and it had, at the end though, again, it had the spring coming, and spring, renewal, and hope. But it was really, the last page is, but that winter, the village was destroyed in the war. You cannot get darker than that. No. The people barely escaped with their lives and moved to other places. Now no one lives in the village. However, a spring always follows a harsh winter. The village of Pagman waits quietly for everyone's return. That is an amazing ending to horrible ending, to bring it back up with hope.
And it doesn't feel like false hope. It doesn't feel like in the next spring everybody came back to the village. It's more like a future hope or a lingering hope. So when you bring back that hope, make sure it feels real and it's earned in your stories. So all right, do we have any more on this topic that we want to talk about today, everybody? This has been a great discussion.
Yes, has been.
It has.
Right. Thank
Thanks,
you for all of our
everybody.
listeners and followers for following us, and look for our Picture Book Summit podcast and learn more about the next upcoming Picture Book Summit at picturebooksummit.com. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Summit. Picture Book Summit. Picture Book Summit.